Cool. Thank you all for being here today for this important discussion. After I do a little bit of an intro, I'll turn it over to our moderator and our speakers to actually take us into a deeper discussion of what we're here to talk about. Just as a reminder that if you have any questions at any point that you want answered, feel free to drop those into the chat, and we will have a facilitated question and answer section towards the end and before we close. But before we get started really into the agenda and what we're here to talk about, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge what time it is on the clock of the world, right? As many greats have reminded us, there is such a thing as being too late, and we're all very acutely aware of what we're seeing right now, right? Catastrophic wildfires along the West Coast, millions of fish and other sea creatures that are literally cooking alive right now, forced displacement of people because of hurricanes and flooding and more. And none of this is an accident, right? It's the direct result of the complicity with a system that props up corporate greed. It's a system that values profit over people and over the planet. And it's a direct result of exploitation and extraction, and that's calcified into our current economy. We're here to talk about how we liberate our economy from that system. And when we think about where we are right now, or what time it is right now, it's real that it's too late right now for millions of people, for tens of thousands of species, that we're in a moment. We have a fierce urgency of this moment. And that if we care at all about the survival of our species, of biological, cultural diversity, of the soils and the waters that sustain us and our families and communities, that we absolutely must confront the small handful of corporate CEOs and the greedy politicians that are actually benefiting from the system at the expense of all of us. So what we're looking for is the end of the world as we know it, right? And the end of the world as we know it actually being something more beautiful than any of us imagined it to be. And we know that it will take all of us to get there, right? The diverse skills and roles and relationships that each of us has to offer. So HEAL specifically, Zena, if you can go to the next slide, and thank you for putting these slides together for us. But HEAL specifically does this work in a way that brings together organizations from around the country into an alliance to build our collective power so that we can confront this system of corporate greed, this system of policies that do not work for our people, for our communities, for our planet. And we are doing this in a way that we connect and unite groups. We bring people together. We try to do shared political education and analysis. This webinar is part of a series that we're doing to try to build our shared political analysis so that we can all understand, organize, and agitate for solutions that will work for all of us. So we're trying to advance this shared narrative together that we actually can have something where all people are able to thrive, all communities are able to thrive. It just requires us doing things radically differently than we are right now. So we run a couple of different campaigns. You can learn more about those, but we'll also be making a couple of calls to action at the end of this webinar to really invest more into the campaigns that folks are already running so that we all can take action together. So we can go to the next slide, Zena. Like I mentioned, this webinar is part of a whole set of toolkits that we're putting together that each focus on one plank of our platform. And these toolkits include resources, they include testimonials from our members, they include information about policy solutions, explainers, and ways that you can get involved. And this webinar is the kickoff to our release of a toolkit around plank 3 of our webinar, which we call fair and competitive markets. And we know that that phrase is co-opted in all different kinds of ways, but what we mean is that we are getting away from this stranglehold of corporate greed, a stranglehold that is simply about exploitation and extraction of land and labor and life. And just real quick, if we look at the next slide, we can see that if we talk about food, we know that there's just a small handful of corporations that control our food system. that almost 95% of the food that we eat is a corporate product, and all of us eat, right? So these corporations are literally making decisions about what food that we have access to and whose labor is expendable and whose lives matter. We know that whoever controls our land, our seeds, our food, that's who controls our lives. So this conversation that we're in today and these brilliant speakers that we're going to hear from are for us to talk strategically about how we build the power that we need to confront that power and make the changes that are needed. So we'll hear from some incredible folks. Anim will introduce them. I'm going to turn it over to Anim Steele, who is our brilliant moderator for today. Anim is one of HEAL's co-founders. He's the outgoing executive director of Real Food Generation and Uprooting and Rising. He's literally one of the most brilliant minds and brains that I've encountered. So thank you, Anim, for being willing to moderate this discussion. Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to every single one of you for joining us today for this really important discussion about how we make the change that we need.
Well, thank you, Navina, for grounding us in the fierce urgency of now, really bringing us into the present. And thank you to everyone who's involved in HEAL for holding the spaces like this one for us to like understand and analyze our situation and take action together. So I think all of us that are gathered here appreciate you all for that, and we know it's collective work. It's really, you know, especially with that, you know, background and the understanding what time it is an honor, and it feels like an important pleasure to introduce three great advocates that we're going to hear from, who are each working on liberating our food systems from corporate control, and coming at it from three different perspectives. So I'm excited to introduce Solana Rice, who is the co-founder and a co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation. It's an organization that works to dismantle the existing oppression economy, as they call it, to build a liberation economy through policy advocacy, grassroots organizing, and narrative shift. And we also have Edna Rodriguez, who is the executive director of the Rural Advancement Foundation International, USA, also called RAFI USA, an organization that advocates for economically, racially, and ecologically just farm communities. You know, due to the nature of the farming system, challenging corporate power in the form of industrial ag and factory farming is a large part of RAFI's work. And we also have Danya Rajendra, who is part of the Athena Coalition, which is taking on one of the most powerful corporations out there today, Amazon. Athena brings together local and national organizations representing working people, small business people, people of color, immigrants, and neighbors, along with activists, advocates, policy experts, and academics to stop Amazon's growing powerful grip on our economy and society. So between them, the three are going to talk about the systemic nature of the issue, how we ended up in this place where corporations control so much of our food system, and what's keeping us here. We'll also get to hear about some of the impacts of corporate abuse, the corporate abuse of power on working people, the environment, our economy, and democratic processes. And lastly, we're going to hear what they are doing to fight back against corporate power, and what each of us can do to be part of that fight. So I'm going to just do a quick pause before I get to ask a set of questions, just to make sure that, you know, the speed at which I'm talking and maybe which other folk will talking is working well for our translators. Are we good? All right, someone will message me if not. Well, I want to start with like the big picture. And Solana, this would be, I'd love to start with you. Can you just talk for us for a few minutes about why our food system is so concentrated or consolidated around a relatively few corporations? Like, who is making decisions around that?
Thank you, Anim. And I want to thank everyone at the HEAL Food Alliance. This is quite an honor to join you all. And I honestly look forward to hearing about what everyone's doing and the different perspectives, because it's in these kinds of conversations that we start to uncover all of the ways that corporations have too much control in our lives, honestly. And it's a really good question. I'll say that as I'm a lifelong advocate in terms of racial economic justice. And I'll say, like, agriculture was not, and our food systems was not on my immediate radar until I really started. I actually came through it through the lens of like, well, what is really making our economy run? And it's large corporations. And it turns out these really large corporations have way too much power. So it's not only that we have that we just need to like get smaller companies. We really need to look at how much control in our economy do they have. So my interest is actually from a point of delivering and advancing economic justice for people of color, Black people, Latinx people, Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous people. And at the top, it was mentioned that, you know, we are living in an oppression economy. We really, at Liberation in a Generation, what we started to see, and my background is actually in sort of financial capability and asset building. And when you come at from that side, you're like, okay, let's work with people to make sure that they have savings or make sure that they are entrepreneurs, especially in, you know, rural areas. Well, you quickly come up against corporate power in those scenarios. And the oppression economy for us, I'll just give it some definition and life. It operates through the theft, the exclusion, and the exploitation of people of color. So we can think about in the food system, we can think about land theft from Indigenous folks from the very beginning. We can think about wage theft. We can think about financing and the financing that producers are not getting. We can think about when we think about exclusion, I think the piece, the 1619 piece on the Black sugar farmer reveals so much about how Black farmers and farmers of color have been excluded from the ways we even produce and finance and the land that we have access to, right? The Homestead Act from the very beginning was not for everyone, right? It was supposed to be the 40 acres and a mule for everyone. It was not, and especially for Black people, it was not that at all. And then as a result of that theft and exclusion, now we've put consumers, producers in a very precarious position of being exploited through control and controlled and limiting choice, whether we're talking about the capital and actually gaining capital, whether we're talking about being able to get a job that's well paying. We have very little choice in the matter when corporations are controlling so many parts of our systems, from the supply chain to the financing to even the markets in which we sell our products, right? So I'm sure we'll get to this eventually. We do have a thought about how do we break this cycle of where we're profiting as a nation, we're profiting from racism, that in turn creates really economic insecurity for people of color. And ultimately what that means is our political disenfranchisement. And I'll just leave with a story of John Ingram in Jackson, Mississippi, that had to go up against Koch Foods. Koch Foods is a poultry producer, and they were very controlling about every single piece of John's ability to farm. So he got chickens from them. They often charged him extra fees if the chickens were suffering at all. And so here we are profiting from racism, because we can assume that there were restrictions on his farming that maybe other poultry producers didn't have. This leads to his economic insecurity, right? He is beholden. His entire product is beholden to this one company. And as he voiced his concerns and the problems that he faced during the Obama administration, the USDA went around and interviewed folks. He testified. He went to the state next door, and he testified at a hearing. He came back with a notice from Cook Foods that said, your contract is terminated. So that in turn quickly meant that he was politically disenfranchised, and then we start the cycle all over again of economic disenfranchisement. So really interrupting the cycle of not only economic insecurity, but translating that into political power. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you, Solana. And I hear you really extending the big picture, out very far. It's the whole history of this country and the disenfranchisement and theft that sets the pattern for it. Thank you for setting that table. Danya, you're organizing to confront the behemoth, right? The Amazon, which is not only, of course, the huge tech company, but a huge food retailer, one of the top ones. So just staying in that big picture zone, can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned about the specific rules that make it possible for a company like Amazon to even exist? Like if capitalism is all about market-based competition, like shouldn't our systems actually prevent this from happening? So what are some of the specific rules?
Yeah, is it though? I guess that's what we're talking about. Thank you so much, Anim, and everyone at HEAL for having me. And it is a delight and an honor to be with you, Solana and Edna, talking about this stuff. So let's see. I think I kind of want to pick up where Solana just left off, right? The story she just told about John from Mississippi is very similar to what it's like to be a driver for Amazon. For example, if someone comes to your door wearing that blue and black shirt and holding a box, that person doesn't work directly for Amazon. That person works for a third-party delivery company that probably only works for Amazon, and the kinds of squeeze that that person's boss experiences gets translated to him, her, or them in ways that are were absolutely tried and refined in things like chicken processing. So I don't think we have enough time in my allotted 4 minutes for me to tell you about all the specific rules that lead to the birth of a monster and the growth of a monster like Amazon. But I did want to talk about a couple in particular that kind of fall into the basket of neoliberalism, or the latest version of, I love how Liberation and Generation calls it, an oppression economy. So the latest flavor of oppression economy. And when we think about neoliberalism, I think, at least in my experience, we usually think about union busting, maybe rules like shareholder value maximization instead of stuff that we generally care about in our world, like stakeholder equity. You might also think about work like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore on criminalization and the kind of political economy of criminalization, which I think is also really relevant, or the end of welfare as we know it. But I want to talk about something even more arcane, which is the consumer welfare standard in antitrust. So the consumer welfare standard states that the primary or only way to consider whether something is a destructive monopoly that the government should take action on, monopolies are of course against the law, is whether consumers are harmed. That's the welfare part of consumer welfare. And so there's a number of things that are wrong with this, and all of them are racist. One thing I would just say specifically when we think about customers or consumers is that the presumed customer is almost always white. So Jeff Bezos and Amazon is famously obsessed with customer service. If anyone else saw pictures of the rockets, that's not what I would say he seems to be obsessed with, but you make your own decisions. when they talk about the customer they're obsessed with, they're clearly imagining a white customer. So nothing about the way they've created what they're ostensibly obsessed with is about providing safe and appropriate shopping experiences for people left out and locked out of consumer markets because of racism or gender discrimination or you know, disability. So that's one piece I just want to say. Anyway, the consumer welfare standard has been since the 1980s advanced by a guy named Judge Robert Bork, and it has become kind of the standard in consumer antitrust. And it means that the Federal Trade Commission and other agencies that are charged with protecting people in the United States, especially working people, from the destructive practices of mega firms and monopolies like Amazon, only look at whether or not consumers are getting harmed. And so because Amazon is free, or Google is free, or Facebook is free, we don't, the regulatory apparatus and the courts and others aren't looking at all the huge number of social harms that these firms are visiting on communities, working people, and especially communities of working people of color. All of this, all of the kind of threadbare patchwork of protections for poor people and working people and communities of color that are supposed to function are that threadbare and destroyed because, in no small part, because of racism, because the Reagan Revolution positions people of color, especially African-American people, especially African-American women, as undeserving. And then we saw that again with Trump, that, you know, undocumented people, especially Latinx people, are undeserving of social citizenship. And we saw that at the advent of the war on terror, where Muslims are undeserving of social citizenship. And so this kind of shredding of the social safety net rests on excluding ever more numbers of people from the protections of the state. And so all of this might feel far afield from Amazon, but it's not. Amazon, frankly, is big enough to act however it wants to. And it is both walking in a path paved by enormous corporations before it, from in other sectors, in agriculture, certainly Walmart. I know we're probably going to talk about Walmart a little bit later, in logistics, certainly a number of tech corporations, including Microsoft before it, and making all those things worse. Their connections with fossil fuel, their connections throughout the food system, especially by owning Whole Foods, creates what's called vertical integration. And we don't have government intervention in these dangerous and predatory ways of doing business, because previously people couldn't point to something and say, well, prices went up, so consumers were harmed. And so that's one specific rule.
That's great. Thank you. I mean, you know, you said there's more rules and places, you know, intervention that we can list right now, but what I hear you highlighting is that even when there is like a place for protection, it can be misapplied, and many people can be left out and of thinking about it. Well, thank you. So we're starting to lay out some of the structures and systems, you know, on a federal level, a little bit historical level, corporate level. But Edna, I wonder if you could take us into more of the state level. What does it look like? What does consolidation look like on a state level? And you know, you're based in North Carolina, which is home to almost as many pigs as people, and that's not just because of nature, I think. So why is this the case? You know, what are some of the forces that at play that make that possible?
Thanks, Aneem. This is a really difficult topic to cover in 3 minutes, but I will do my best. Because of the federal government's failure to enforce antitrust regulations, we see this corporate concentration at the state level. But at the state, regional, and local level, I think is where you can best understand how it actually plays out in people's lives. I won't get into a lot of details of the vertical integration and the actual farms. I'll just conclude by saying that the impact has been the loss of family farms over decades. The size of the farms are bigger, the number of animals that are being grown, it's incredibly high. There are more animals than people now. And often people who don't know North Carolina find out that we have hogs and poultry after a hurricane under horrible circumstances. So I was going to focus my attention more so on the ways in which the industry maintains its power at the state level. So one company, for example, Smithfield, I think everybody's probably familiar with this company. They grow hogs, amongst other things. And because of the incredible amount of power that they hold nationally as a monopoly, they've been able to also build power at the state level, both political power and economic power. And that political power goes beyond policy. So, like one would expect, they have poured money into lobbying and made contributions to elected officials and campaigns. But they've also invested a significant amount of money in PR efforts and astroturfing efforts to change the narrative so that people will be more likely to support them and defend them. So you'll see companies like Smithfield, and there are some others, make contributions to, for example, charities, churches, food banks. They fund the North Carolina Pork Council, which is a 501c4, I believe, lobbying special interest group. They describe themselves as representing farmers. They actually represent the industry, and they do a pretty good job of it. So Smithfield is practically untouchable in this state. Public policy is written expressly to protect their interests. And so far, despite all of our best efforts, that continues to be the case. They also hold a lot of economic power. Because of the monopolistic nature of the industry, they're the only choice in a whole variety of ways. They're the only choice for farmers who want to keep their land, and they're looking for ways to retain generational land in the family. But they may also be the choice for different businesses. When you do vertical integration, you own all aspects of it. So they take over the entire rural economies. So it's not difficult to understand why everybody defends them, and people are afraid of losing their livelihoods because everything is tied back to Smithfield. And lastly, I'll end with saying that subsidies. The entire thing is held up by subsidies. Both at the federal level and at the state level, in all ways: tax cuts, tax credits, economic development dollars, grants, infrastructure investments. It's incredible how much money goes into protecting the industry and supporting them. Bailouts, and it's at the expense of workers, consumers, communities, and usually these operations are in communities of color, and there's no accountability whatsoever for the harms that they impose on us.
Thank you for painting that picture. I think that really takes us, as much as we can in just a few minutes into what it looks like in a state. And I see in the comments that Smithfield sounds like it's a familiar name in rural places. Actually, some people, I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and I don't know that I see Smithfield that often here, but I imagine just because of the concentration of industry, much of the poultry that I might encounter, pork that I might encounter could come from Smithfield, and I don't know it, but it's known in those places. So great, thank you. Actually, Edna, I wonder if we can just I want to switch into thinking talking a little bit more about the impacts. All of you started to touch on that in a way, and I think it's really important to have a human-centered vision of what this means. So maybe we could just, Edna, if there's anything else you want to add about the impacts on producers or on people living in North Carolina in terms of a public health experience from the very concentrated hog industry there. Is there anything else to add there, or do you feel like you've covered it?
Sure. One of the, something that's true, I think, for all monopolies is that once you have an industry that's controlled by one entity, it makes it really hard for others to compete. especially if they're vertically integrated and they own everything. So, you know, when in the past there used to be suppliers, now everything is owned and controlled by that one company. So if you're a small producer and you want to get into hog farming, every single thing is harder for you. The tax subsidies aren't there. The federal programs aren't made for you. Even the prices that are the government programs that do exist, the prices are set based on what the industry prices would be, not based on like heritage breeds, for example, which are higher cost. So you wouldn't be able to recoup those. Feed costs, Smithfield can buy at a huge, you know, in huge quantities, whereas a small producer can't. And that's all in addition to what, you know, farmers of color would already face just doing business in any place in this country. So.
Yeah. And I know it's, you kind of highlighted some issues of like getting into the, you know, getting into the market as a farmer who's not well resourced, maybe a Black farmer. No, Solana also talked about experience of John Ingram, who was forced out of the industry. Impacts in multiple ways. Let's take a look at the worker experience too. I see there's some comments in the chat, but perhaps Danya, you could talk a little bit more about that from a perspective of Amazon or, you know, Walmart. Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the impact on workers?
Yeah. So first, everything that Edna talked about around Smithfield, we could say the same. It's a similar story about Amazon. And one way I think that they're probably the same, but Edna, you'll let me know, is that they also occupy and expand until they fully colonize a niche in the economic ecosystem. So with Amazon, they're not only a monopoly in that they have a huge chunk of like cloud computing and web services. For example, Zoom runs on AWS. Slack runs on AWS, and if you're tired and ready to Netflix and chill, unfortunately, Netflix also runs on AWS. And that's part of where they make the fastest money that helps subsidize their employment footprint. They're also soon to be the nation's largest private sector employer, taking over from Walmart, which is currently the nation's largest private sector employer. And when you monopolize a labor market, it's called a monopsony, which I really like to say because it's a really fun word to say out loud. And a monopoly of the labor market leaves people with no other options, which is such an important part of what Edna was saying in her story too, or part of what I heard, Edna, and what you were saying, and part of what is also the story in Solana's telling of John Ingram's experience, right? Is you're locked in or you're locked out or both, right? That there's almost no freedom in the economic life. And so that's why I think it's really important that we're super clear that the consequence of monopoly is fascism, like period, the end. That's why I care about monopoly and competition policy as a person who cares about workers. So I imagine that folks on this webinar are super familiar with the ways in which Amazon is an incredibly terrible, might be the technical term, just trash place to work. And, you know, it's because people are worked at an inhumane pace. It's because the facilities are barely climate controlled when they are. It's because you have almost no control over your schedule. It's because they have this thing called hands off the wheel, where the human resources department is like your worst ever call to the insurance company or the airline when you have to push one and push two and you never get a human. It's because, as you probably know, they tried, you know, the people have to relieve themselves in bottles. It's because, you know, they did all sorts of nefarious shenanigans around the union effort in Alabama that is currently being basically litigated. And Amazon, when they try to come here to Queens, where I live, and get those kinds of subsidies that Edna was talking about Smithfield, it came out later that they have this posture that's basically F you, except they're not as polite as I am, we're Amazon. And that's what happens. They're big enough that they think they can tell government how to function. So Amazon fired a number of people who spoke up about the dangers of COVID exposure in last year, and New York State Attorney General Tish James, investigated that because it's a violation of New York State labor law. And before James announced her suit, Amazon sued her, trying to prevent her from enforcing New York State protections of workers. And so you can really see the kind of fraying of neoliberalism and this jockeying of like who's really in charge. And there are very few experiences that are more authoritarian than working in an American workplace without a union or worker protections. And Amazon is exporting that worker relations model abroad. So I just want to say in closing, again, that the consequence of monopoly is fascism. American fascism has a very specific character. It's intensely racist, and it's often, Christian fundamentalist. And in the United States, it takes many forms: plantation slavery, company towns, which we talk about Amazon as a company town, Jim Crow and redlining, indigenous displacement, colonization and surveillance, which I think, really speak to some of the things that Edna was saying and some of the things Solana was saying about what is the experience of being captured in the web of a corporation like this, and why is it so important that we understand antitrust and anti-monopoly policy levers as part and parcel of how we're going to break free and build a liberation economy and a democracy that finally represents us all.
I want to pick right up on that. You talked about just now the levers of antitrust, anti-monopoly, and I'm reliving some experience I've had before when those words are said. Some amount of people tune out because it's technical. It sounds like you have to have an economic degree to understand it. So I just want to bring it back maybe to Solana, right? So we really underscore this. Why? If you are a person of color or someone who cares about people of color and justice, why should you not tune out when the words about monopoly, monopsony, et cetera, come about? How is this related to building a liberation economy?
Yeah, we have to remember always that the building of this nation's economy is not separate from racism, and that racism is not separate from the building of this economy. And so if we are interested in the project of democracy, of a really inclusive economy, then we have to go about it in anti-racist ways. And we have to have more tools than only antitrust, right? Because antitrust considers us only as consumers, and we are so much more than consumers, right? As both of my co-panelists have talked about, we're workers. We are also just residents of communities that do not want to be overrun by large corporations. Corporations are telling our local legislators and our state legislators what to do. We live multiple lives. And so for us at Liberation and a Generation, again, we just can't stand to separate the fact that our racial caste system in this nation came up and was birthed at the same time as the economy. And I just want to underscore a through line and just like make sure that this is clear and plain as day, that Edna and Dania were bringing up, that the solutions have to lie in our collective governance of corporations. We have to come together and decide what is the role that we want corporations to play. And the federal government, through subsidies, through crop insurance, people have named a whole host of things, regulations and rules. That is the largest lever to, in my opinion, to stemming this corporate power and to really checking what is it that we want. So I really salute HEAL for coming with a platform that really acknowledges the role of our federal government and our ability as individuals to make sure that the tools that the federal government has are also anti-racist, are also about centering people of color, and that we're coming up with new tools. Like we're not limited to just the ones that we have on the books, and now we're seeing some opportunity to do that. So I'll stop there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I want to kind of ride that wave and ask you all about the some of the approaches that you're taking. We'll probably have time at the end to think about, to list some of the specific things that are going on, but I do want to hear about some general approaches. Let me just do a quick reminder though for folks that are listening. I see, people saying great information is coming out. If you have questions that are popping up or comments, you want to put them in the chat. We will kind of take a look at them. We'll have a chance later on to at least address a few of them. So feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat. We'll get back to them. But to bring it back to these three warriors here, what are you and your organizations doing? What's your approach to confronting corporate control and moving us from this oppressive economy to a liberation economy? And you know what? Let's go. I'll start with you, Edna.
Sure, thanks, Anim. Well, in addition to working with farmers who've been were victims of the system and have lost their contracts, we take an approach that involves both policy and then also building an alternative and inclusive markets for farmers. So on the policy side, we've been working for years on antitrust, which is boring, I admit. But I think of it as corporate colonization. That helps me get more like excited about it. We're heading into a farm bill season, and we really want to go into that farm bill season with that focus on corporate power, but we're really interested in a cross-sector alliance this time, because it's not just in agriculture, it's every single sector you think of. It's happening across the board: hospitals, retail, telecommunications, everywhere. The second piece is where the liberation economy comes into play. We're working with farmers. We're awarding grants to farmers, livestock farmers, working on building collectives, and providing technical assistance. We also have projects matching up farmers with churches to try to come up with non-traditional buying arrangements, because we feel that working outside of that entire system is the only way right now until we dismantle the corporate stronghold that farmers can make a decent living.
Are you doing work at a state policy level too? Or is that feel, what you described seems like it's so locked down, it almost feels hard to move there.
Yeah, we focus on the federal. At the state level, we haven't seen any opportunities to really make change yet. They really have the companies have the state locked down for now. So we see more opportunities at the federal level.
Thank you. So federal level and then
at least here in North Carolina. That may not be the case somewhere elsewhere.
North Carolina, and building your own economic alternatives with farmers. Great. Danya, what is your approach and the approach of the Athena Coalition?
Yeah, our members organize. It's really hard to do antitrust work at the state level. So I feel your pain, Edna. And I'm excited to be kind of bringing a bunch of new organizers into the antitrust space. Hopefully that will feel like a breath of fresh air and some new comrades. So at Athena, when we think about anti-colonial struggles and historic US labor, the best of US labor history, we think about how it takes everyone to upend the company in a company town. And so absolutely, we have folks who are organizing workers. We have folks organizing small business owners and community business owners and other independent business owners. We have folks organizing neighbors around environmental racism and climate devastation. We have folks organizing against gentrification. I saw in the chat someone's from Virginia, talked about how the local government and the state government in Virginia really welcomed Amazon with open arms. So there are some exciting wins that came out of that organizing, even as Amazon is absolutely building possibly the world's ugliest building. I'm sorry, people of Virginia, just outside of the Pentagon. And we organize folks to take action locally to try to keep Amazon out if that's what they think is best for their communities, or to wrest from Amazon coming in the best possible deal for their local communities, at the state level where there are state policies to enforce or to pass. And at the federal level, as I said, we work on antitrust and other kinds of worker protection stuff, as well as like things like banning facial recognition and the way data is used and collected, and all things that might diminish the kind of vertical and horizontal interlocking that makes a monopoly tick. And we go directly at the corporation and tell them what needs to change. And in particular, I want to shout out the folks who work on privacy and surveillance. One, there's a commitment from Amazon not to sell technology to local law enforcement. And those are, we don't often in 2021 get to embarrass corporations into doing the right thing, but when we do, we should celebrate it. So those are some things that we're working on, and we're always happy to talk about folks who want to work in formation.
Thank you. I feel quite encouraged and energized actually by hearing that. Just I feel like, yeah, everywhere they are, which is everywhere, like a sense of like still resisting and pushing back. So thank you. Organize, organize, organize. Solana, what does liberation in a generation? How do you approach this?
Yeah. Well, the Liberation in a Generation is a movement support organization. So we are here to help set tables and spaces for leaders like Edna and Danya, and organizers, researchers, advocates, to help do some of the not only like policy agenda work. We also know that we need a lot of research on the topic of the correlation between racial injustice and corporate concentration. We wrote a paper earlier this year that sort of talked about the ways that people of color, as consumers, as workers, as residents, as business owners, are impacted by corporate concentration, but there is still a lot of research to be done about the correlation and causation. And that's what we're hoping to start gathering people around, and it's sort of sector and industry agnostic, because there are a lot of places where we could do that research. So not only that, but like I said, reimagining what the tools are in our toolbox, the limitations, going beyond the limitations of antitrust. And then also, I think someone noted in the chat that the story of what we're telling about company towns, about the real faces and the real people impacted by these decisions that are not being made at the federal level, and the decisions that allow these corporations to flourish unhindered. We need a real strategy around that, and we think it's a combination of advocates and researchers and organizers coming together around those things, not just any one group or any one type of formation. So we're really honored to start thinking through with folks like Heal and others what that might look like, and just we welcome folks to participate in that.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, I really recommend the report. That's it's great. It's in the chat, called From Liberation in a Generation, called Anti-Monopoly Activism, Reclaiming Power Through Racial Justice. Well, I think it's a great time to shift into some dialogue with everyone here. Thank you all so much for sharing, what you have so far. Before I go to questions from participants, is there anything that's come up that you, Solana, Dania, Edna, want to ask each other? There's plenty of questions if not, but I do want to give you that chance if something's popped up. Yes, Edna.
I'm really curious about the experience of Amazon sellers, if there are any independent sellers left, which I'm not sure. And how that could compare to the drivers, and then also making that leap in comparison to contract growers.
Yeah. So the majority of things that are for sale on Amazon don't come from like Amazon itself. They come from what are known as third-party sellers. That's what Edna's talking about, in case you aren't familiar. And I think one of the things we say
yeah, actually, I think can you say what you mean by independent sellers before you?
Sure.
Yeah.
So as a customer, ours is a non-guilt-based movement. Amazon is a monopoly. It's fine if you order things on Amazon. So I'm going to assume that everyone has been on the Amazon website, right? If you go to order something, like right now, I'm like obsessed with these delicious and sort of weird Japanese snacks. I buy them locally from a local business, but if you don't have one of those in your neighborhood and you want to order these snacks, you can look them up on Amazon. And chances are the person you're going to order them from is not actually Amazon. Amazon is really more like, this is a terrible analogy. Please forgive me, Heal Friends. It is more like when you go to the farmer's market, the market is the market, that would be Amazon, and each of the stalls is its own third-party seller, except farmers markets are good and Amazon is evil. So that would be obviously very different. So most of the things are sold by independent or third-party sellers. Unlike your, I'm very sorry, Rosie, I'm very sorry. Unlike one's experience at a farmer's market, hopefully, yeah, just like eBay or Etsy. Unlike one's experience, hopefully, selling your organic goods at your local farmer's market, the experience of selling stuff on Amazon is atrocious, much akin to being a worker or a driver. And so one of the things that we see, which I think is probably similar to part of what you're saying, Edna, is that in fact, though people are nominally independent business owners or ostensibly independent business owners, in fact, every part of the production is really controlled by the most powerful entity, which in this case is Amazon. And so if you're trying to sell your snacks or your hair ties or your organic coconut shea butter cream on Amazon, in order to what's known as win the buy box, which is like a means trying to order hair ties for someone else, and he's going to pick your hair tie, he's going to pick Edna's hair ties instead of Dania's hair ties. It's because Edna has paid a ton of money to Amazon. In fact, their fastest growing revenue stream are fees and service fees paid by independent businesses. So it's as if in order to just extend my farmer's market thing, right, you have to pay your farmer's market fees, and then you have to outspend the other farmers to have your stall in the front in order to sell your, right now we're selling cucumbers in my local farmer's market. So everything about the experience of being a independent business vis-a-vis Amazon is about being controlled by the system that Amazon has put into place. And that's not hugely dissimilar from working for Amazon or being a subcontracted driver for Amazon or being the neighbor of Amazon in Southern California or Illinois, where they're making governing decisions about water usage, air quality, traffic, etc. Thank you for giving me a much better analogy than our. I love my farmers markets, and I really appreciate all of you do to make sure that there are farmers markets. And so, Edna, we talk about how it's, part of why I think it's so important to pay close attention to the way that Amazon treats the people who work directly for it is because that's the place where they have the most control. And that the way they exert control is the way they govern, and the way they exert control over workers is how they're going to govern us all. And that feels pretty similar to what you're saying about Smithfield as a neighbor or as a governing authority vis-a-vis the state government and things like that. And so we find that connecting those people creates different avenues of policy levers or other ways to organize that kind of aggregate our power. And so I've been talking a long time, I'm going to stop now, but I would say that one of the things we're really excited about is Lena Khan as the chair of the FTC, and really hopeful signs from the administration and from parts of the Democratic Party. And we always look, it's a C3 call, I imagine. So we're always looking for other reasons to be optimistic about all other possible parties who might get on this bandwagon. But since what's in the news are Democrats, really taking another look at corporate consolidation. They're starting with big tech, but we really feel, as someone who works on a big tech issue, that it's not really about tech at all. It's just about big business and about corporate control.
And
yeah, go ahead.
well, and I had a question for Edna as well, if that's okay.
Sure.
I think we're seeing the retribution of being politically active. And so I'm curious about how, and maybe Dania has thoughts on this too, how do we protect people in being advocates from being economically harmed from these big corporations at the same time?
Geez, that's a hard one. So our whole approach with livestock farmers is to have them work independent and outside of the entire system to protect them from that. So they're creating their own markets and even possibly sourcing from other farmers that are independent as well. Because once you go into business with one of the big companies, you give over power to them. So I don't see any way of engaging. It's kind of like an Amazon seller. Once you become an Amazon seller, they can put you out of business, with one click, and you have no say in how that happens. So
that's actually a really helpful answer, because I think folks, at least I would love to think like, wow, we can still organize within but it's, yeah, I think that's a good warning too.
Well, I think it's not dissimilar from the way in which Amazon has fired whistleblowers, which I would be remiss if I did not say all of the blue collar workers they've fired for being whistleblowers about COVID are Black. I'm sure it's a coincidence. I'm sure. But I think that what we're seeing is that people are choosing that rather than continuing this system. And I myself am actually super moved by that. And I think a lot about the ways in which independent business, again, like as Edna said and Solana said, like antitrust and competition policy can feel really wonky and far from the lifeblood of racial and economic justice movements or freedom movements. But like the role that Black co-ops and both Black and white people who had freedom from the economic structures in the Jim Crow South, for example, were able to foster and kind of form a greenhouse around the green shoots of organizing and civil rights organizing, Black liberation organizing. We wouldn't have had a civil rights movement without those independent economic actors. And similarly, when we think about the queer liberation movement, if there hadn't been queer bars and like independent business that protected folks, we wouldn't have Stonewall, right? And so there's really a role for the kind of thing that Edna is talking about in protecting people in times of repression, and also in fostering and protecting the green shoots of liberatory movements. And this is absolutely capitalist economy and a capitalist system, and that means some financial independence in communities. And so I just think, I think that's just so important to think about.
I love that, because sometimes I think we can get into different camps, and it's got to be either an alternative, you know, separate economy, or, you know, all we have to do is to like break down the, you know, the big walls. But I hear you kind of talking about both are necessary.
All of it, we're all about all the solutions all of the time.
Right. I have a question from Anne, who was wondering if there are states where there is progress or success in driving through policy changes.
On antitrust?
On antitrust, yeah. It sounded like pretty dim to begin with, but we'll open the door a little bit to see if there's a crack somewhere.
A number of states' attorneys general have taken on Facebook, although that lawsuit has just faced a setback. I'm less familiar outside. Sadly, Amazon consumes too much of my brain, and I don't know where else to look for bright spots. I think part of the challenge of doing state-based antitrust enforcement is that corporations are multinational or national in scope, and that because they cross state borders, it can be hard to hold them accountable to state laws around trade in a way that is different than environmental regulations or you know, worker protections or the other kinds of things that we work on.
Sure. Yeah, and you know, actually, I'm recalling that it was in just to give some, you know, glimmers of hope. I think it was in 2017 when an organizing effort defeated a corporate ag effort in Oklahoma, of all places, that would have extended factory farming. It was called a right to farm, one of those terrible euphemism bills. So, and actually turned around the poll. So some things are possible. Let me find another question. How about let's come back to, there was a question about, you know, what do you panelists think of President Biden's appointment of antitrust advocate Lena Khan to the Federal Trade Commission, also, you know, called the FTC, as you mentioned, Danya. So Sanrasi, I think you've already mentioned this. Maybe I can broaden it to, are there other things that you see changing in the landscape at a federal level or at a narrative level? And anyone can pick this up. What's different today than it might have been 5 years ago or even a year ago?
Solani, you want to talk about exploding the consumer welfare standard, or Edna, I don't know if that's where your antitrust.
I was actually going to go towards the executive order, which I think opens up quite a bit of possibility on competition in our food system. And I think Edna can probably speak more directly to the actual legislation. All I'm going to underscore is that it's a start, just like all of the appointments that we are so excited about are a start, and it is not the finish line. There is so much work to be done to make sure that as these agencies are writing rules, that they don't repeat and embed oppression in them, because we can see how it does it over and over again, whether it's like, oh, we'll leave it up to the states to decide some things, or oh, we'll just keep some things in practice because it's just how it's always been. We have to be really vigilant about all of the details, and organizing one another to be sort of echoing the details too. And it's hard because those things move quickly, and we have a lot on our plate, but like, we absolutely can't just assume that an executive order is going to mean great things at the agency level. And please, like, say more.
Yeah, I was going to mention the executive order as well. Well, first of all, we've spent the last 4 years fighting stuff, so it's really nice to see something that's in the other direction, right? So, but it is just an executive order, and it has a lot of recommendations and encouraging different departments to do various things, which I thought was pretty comprehensive. It was way better than what I expected, and it does give me hope. But there's still a ton of work. If you take the time to read that document and see how long it is. I mean, they literally had to go through every single department, and it's a giant list of actions that need to be taken. So it's going to take the state attorney generals getting involved, and also people having to support the whole idea of antitrust, which is boring. But hey.
And can you say what the executive order was that came about recently, that Biden signed recently?
It was how many days ago? A few days ago. It's called the Executive Order on Promoting Competition in the American Economy. And it goes through and makes recommendations for competition, fostering competition in the economy. I really do encourage people to read it. It's extensive.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and one of those things that I think it does is start to open up the number of constituencies concerned, right? Like that instead of just consumer welfare, we're also looking about like, well, what does market consolidation mean for workers? What does market consolidation mean for the environment? What does market consolidation mean on a number of fronts? Not just like, are you getting stuff cheaper? So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Well, it is striking to have something versus having no possibility, and for people who've been working in the anti-monopoly space for years, I think just feeling like nothing will ever happen, to have a crack. I know in our work around the concentrated cafeteria industry on K through 12 and education and colleges, hospitals, another highly concentrated industry, like the idea that we might have the Federal Trade Commission take a look at the behind the scenes practices, the kickback, similar to what you talked about with Amazon, that helped to reinforce their power. That idea is encouraging. So what about, I don't want to maybe go by without just mentioning some of the environmental impacts. Someone asked about that. Can you speak about the environmental impacts these corporations have on communities? And we have, I think we're going to try to bring questions to a close in about 4 minutes or so. And maybe Edna, I'll start with you on that. Or
environmental impacts. Well, in North Carolina, if you've may not be familiar with the lawsuits that came out of the situation in Eastern North Carolina, people's homes being sprayed, and the impacts, adverse health impacts, and property values going down because of that. It's trying to hold the company accountable really didn't go anywhere because the legislature stepped in. Also, none of the environmental regulations are really being enforced at the federal or state level. So.
Okay. There's an interesting question about cross-industry organizing. North Carolina, Kentucky have a long history of anti-company town, organizing against kind of company towns. Is there any luck using this story or framework to connect with towns who remember the devastation of those company towns? think you could broaden it to being other ways in which a narrative is connecting with folks. Okay, well, food for thought. Chime in if you do have an answer to that. And I think I will, maybe in the interest of making sure we have time for a few other announcements, I might leave it there. Actually, let me, there's one other question I saw, which is about how can we support unionizing efforts at Amazon?
Well, as far as I know, there are no, well, there's one organizing, there are many kinds of worker organizing efforts at Amazon, and not all of them are unions, but everyone can benefit from your support. So a couple of things that the workers always tell us that I like to pass on is that while we're not a guilt-based movement, everyone orders stuff from Amazon. It's really better if you don't order things that are heavy, because that's the primary cause of injury. So dog food, kitty litter, cases of water or soda or stuff like that. If you can at all not order that, that's better for people. That's like one thing you could do. And then obviously you can sign up to join the Athena list or follow us on Twitter, and we'll keep you apprised of all kinds of organizing that you can lend your support to. And finally, antitrust is boring and it's somewhat arcane and a little bit weird, but it is a really great tool to F with Amazon. And like, in order to organize, in order to fit a corporation like Amazon into a liberation economy, we are both going to have to shut some mess that it does down, like surveil people of color, and we're going to have to fix a bunch of stuff about it. And in order to fix a bunch of stuff about it, we have to make it smaller and in smaller pieces. And that's so much about why we're committed to antitrust tools. So come on in, the water's fine. Well, can't wait to swim with you in these funny waters.
That is that's a great note to segue on. Thank you. And I just want to acknowledge that there are a few more questions. I'm not going to get to them now, but there was one that was I'll just picking out one of them that I happened to register about an interest in building cooperative local agricultural models, an alternative food system, not just compared to the architect of the single family farm, and how can regional food economies build their own infrastructure that can compete with vertical integration. And so I just recognizing we can't do the kind of get your thoughts on the question at this point, but I just want to bring that out as a way to like highlight what I've heard as a really a spectrum of like tools and responses, right? From that to like organizing to the actions and tools that may exist at the federal level, from the Federal Trade Commission to other entities that I know if we had time that you could name, but it's great to know that people like what those are, so we don't all have to be experts ourselves. We do this together. So just appreciating the spectrum of possibilities you're putting in front of us.
Thank you so much, Rosie, for putting everything together for our webinar, to all of the HEAL staff team for really just throwing down to make this happen. And of course, a huge shout out to our speakers, Anim for moderating, Solana, Danya, and Edna for all of the incredible work that you were doing every day to confront these systems of power. We're so grateful for all that you do and grateful to be part of community and movement with you. Just so folks know, HEAL is also in the process right now of really dreaming up what our most strategic and most impactful campaign to address corporate consolidation will be. And we'll really be taking that on together over these next few years to obviously address corporate consolidation and racism, which is the foundation of what we do, is to confront and break down those things while we're building power in local communities. So please, if you haven't already, Stay in touch with us, follow us through social media, or sign up for our email list to learn more about these campaigns as we develop them in deeper and more strategic conversation with folks like the brilliant ones that you just heard from. We're grateful, again, to be part of Movement with you, and let's make some change together. Thanks, y'all. And I'm going to turn it back to DJ Manzo to see us out.